This is the third episode of the Novus 2 classes for LionsGate University of TUR. When we start out, I would just like to acknowledge that LionsGate covers the Musqueam, Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Kwantlen unceded territories. Welcome everybody, and welcome Sir Antonio. Thank you for presenting to us this evening on SCA history and terminology. Waves Sir Antonio.
Okay, hi everyone. So this is a funny course for me to teach. The history part is right up my alley. I'm a big fan of SCA history. The terminology part is a little bit stranger, as we were talking about earlier. So we'll see how that goes. But it's also interesting because having been in the SCA for 40 years, a lot of this stuff is like, well, duh, everyone knows why the ERIC is called the ERIC. So it's hard for me to sort of find the balance of what parts people are going to be interested in, what parts people are going to be bored stiff by. So I'm absolutely happy to be directed by your attention spans. So if I end up talking about stuff that is completely boring to everyone, feel absolutely free to start yelling at me for boring you. And if there's stuff that I'm skimming over and you want me to drone on more and more about, I'm a teacher for a living, and I guarantee you I can drone on as long as you would like me to. So so don't be shy at all about jumping in and giving me some feedback. Can you unspotlight me, actually, whoever just did that? To go back to my regular gallery. There we go. Thanks. You can spotlight me later on if you want. But I want to start with, I just want to run through sort of people's experience. I got Bjorn and Katrina started telling us about her experience, but I don't think we got very far. Can you guys just sort of let me know how long have you been around, what you've been up to in the SCA, stuff like that?
Would you like me to go again, sir?
Go again. Sure. We're recording and some people weren't here.
All right, so I'm Bjorn. I'm from the Shire of Appledore. I've been around maybe like 5 or 6 years. I've been saying that for probably just as long. Feels like forever. I'm a very new heavy fighter who's technically been fighting for like 3 years, but it's only really been a year since, you know, everything. I like arts and sciences, but I never took any like classes to figure everything out, so that's why I'm here tonight.
Perfect. Thank you. Is it Katrine or Katrina?
It's Katrin.
It's, of course, the option I didn't pick. Hi, Katrin.
Okay.
How long have you
Hi.
been in the SCA, and what have you
Okay.
done classes and so on?
Okay, so I joined March 2020, so the month that basically everything shut down, and I just got to go to my first event last weekend.
Yay.
Yep, I do enjoy sewing and scribble work and calligraphy, and I've did a little bit of null blinding. I've basically been teaching myself with online blogs and things like that, and videos, trying to get a sense of, you know, how to create the garb and that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm a teacher by trade, teacher librarian, and so yeah, I've been enjoying kind of getting to know people through Zoom basically, and then putting faces to people at the event last week was rather nice. So
Nice.
thank you.
So you're in LionsGate also?
Lionsdale.
Cool. Leslie, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. I just didn't want to be on camera, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
I actually started in the SCA in 1968 in Berkeley, and I was there for about 3-4 years, something like that. Made myself a few costumes, attended a few events. Don't think I ever registered a name though. And then life took me elsewhere. Recently, some other family from Berkeley has moved up to Canada, and we're all in the, well, they're in Nanaimo, I'm down in Linden. So I'm in Shire of Thornwell. I'm not quite sure. I think they're in Seagirt, but I'm not sure. Anyway, we all started talking about the good old days and decided that I think they've done some Ren Fair and quite a bit of reenactments since then. They've done a lot of costuming and stuff. But anyway, we talked about it, and great minds think alike. We all joined up again on the same day. So I'm back into it. And so I'm a newbie, but not a newbie, if you know what I mean.
You might be able to correct me on some of the stuff I have to say about the early history, so that'll work well.
I guess the only other thing of note in the early history is I don't know if you're aware of OWL, the Order of Wizard Lore. I was a part of that as well.
No, I've never heard of that. You can tell us all about it later on.
Sounds good.
I'm going to skip Nurgwe and Kevin and Miles if that's okay, because they've been around forever, so they don't really fall into the whole SCA, the people who need to know this stuff. So, oops, I'm just going happily to my screen without sharing it. There we go. Okay, so this is me. I'm Sir Antonio. As I said, I've been in the SCA since I was 12, and I'm 50 now, so that's sort of 40-ish years. I said earlier, this is an odd class because the terminology and the history are a curious thing to go together, but we'll see what happens. So I have sort of a vague agenda that I'm interested in here, but I'm not at all attached to it. So really, I sort of want everyone to feel absolutely free to subvert this completely. I think I'll skip over what the SCA is. I have one brief thing I want to say about that. We'll go through some quick sort of very early history. There's some parts of the first year or so that I find really interesting. We'll skim through some important dates for An Tir. And then I've got a whole bunch of terminology and stuff that I'm hoping you guys can help me kind of backfill in some definitions. And then we'll see where we get from there. Cool. Let's do her. So as I was doing some research for this, somebody very generously gifted me with a whole bunch of old newcomers manuals. The first one was from 75, the second was from 82, I think. And then I looked through the one that's currently on the SCA page. And there was something that was really interesting to me about it, which was that they were talking about not only the fact that this isn't an observed activity, it's a collaborative activity that you have to take part in. There was a lot of emphasis in those early ones about embodying the ideas of courtly chivalry, which I find interesting, and I'm happy to sort of have a conversation about this or not if people want. I don't know if this is the people I hang around with, but I feel like that's a thing which is no longer as prevalent in the SCA. And I don't mean that to diss people and say we're unchivalrous. What I mean is I remember in the early days, if somebody mentioned work, sort of everyone looked askance, like, oh my goodness, you're bringing the modern world into it. And I feel like now more and more we're people wearing funny clothes. So when I go to an event, I'm Toby wearing curtains rather than I'm embodying Antonio in some meaningful way. And I find that distinction kind of interesting. So to me, that's one of the things that separates sort of those early days. When I hear sort of the early politics, they're so embedded in a sense of a bunch of people actually figuring out what fealty and kingdoms are. Whereas now it's a lot of modern people running bureaucracies through Zoom meetings. And I find that distinction intriguing. So the early days of the SCA. I'm sure we've all heard the stories about the first event. Do you guys want to tell me what you know about the absolute genesis of the SCA?
My understanding was it started with a party at Diana Paxton's house.
Yeah. Oops. Right. So I'm trying to get a page here. So there's Diana there. The very first event started with a party at Diana's house. But that's actually not 100% accurate, as it happens. If you go back and talk to the people who were there were two guys, Siegfried von Hoflichkeit and Fulk de Wivern, who sort of were doing a bunch of SCAS stuff earlier than that. So I think it was Siegfried had been stationed in Germany and had learned how to fence. And so he came back and was teaching his friend Ken de Meef how to fence. And they decided they wanted to do some chivalric stuff. They wanted to discover what it was like to be medieval knights. And so they made themselves some, I'm sure, very unsafe wooden swords and some, I'm sure, very unsafe metal shields. And they were wailing away at each other in their backyard. And although stories differ on what actually happened, either Diana went to their house or they went to Diana's house. And Diana saw this. And she remembered this thing because she was a medieval history buff called The Last Tournament. Has anyone heard of The Last Tournament? Yeah. So we all know it's the Last Tournament was, I want to say 1830, I think I might have the year wrong, it might be 1829. Some Scottish laird full of the notions of Walter Scott. And I'm sure we all know this. Our conception of the Middle Ages is completely contaminated by Victorian ideals, right? They were very keen on the Middle Ages. There were the pre-Raphaelites and all this stuff. And so a lot of the sort of what we think of as Vikings with big horned helmets and fainting maidens and big strong knights, a lot of that is Victorian morality laid on to a complete misunderstanding of what was happening in the Middle Ages. So these people decided they were going to have a big tournament. And so a bunch of British aristocracy had, I'm sure, very, very inaccurate clothes made in the modern fashion. London rang out with hammer blows of armors, making what I have to assume was terrible and not very functional armor. Everyone was very excited. It was a social event of the season. And of course, it was England, so it rained buckets. And the field turned into mud, and all the tents turned into rags. And it was awful and a failure, and everyone agreed never to speak of it again. And Diana heard about this, and watching her friends, Ken DeMafe and his friend, I forget what his, Stephen something or other, watching them sword fighting in their backyard, she said, hey, let's do that again. And stories again differ on this. It might have been influenced by the fact that she was going off to the Peace Corps and she wanted to be able to brag about having had a medieval tournament in her backyard. But there was this idea that she was going to have this event. So that prehistory, I think, is somewhat important for a whole pile of reasons. The big one is that Siegfried and Fulk figure large in sort of the early conceptions of the SCA, and the notion that the SCA was born out of medieval combat is something I, of course, as a knight, am deeply interested in. So they agreed to do it on May Day, May 1st, 1966. They have the first event. And of course, Fulk and Siegfried are the first guys to fight on the first field. And sort of my favorite story in all of SCA history is the story of the first knighting. So everybody shows up on May 1st to this thing, and all the ladies were ladies, and all the guides were knights. They all called themselves Sir whatever, except one guy. David the Herald was a young kid, and so he decided he was going to squire for the day to Siegfried von Hofflichkeit. But he was kicking butt on the field. And so Siegfried, looking out over the field, said, hey, he's doing really well. And so because they thought they were just doing this once and it was going to be a good time and nothing mattered, Siegfried had him kneel in the field and knighted him on the spot. And to me, this is not only important, I mean, it's always funny looking back at these things that were totally accidental as sort of these big seminal moments in historical events. But to me, I think this was a really seminal moment in the history of the SCA, because it dictated that the SCA was going to be a place where you earned your status by merit, where it wasn't that you just automatically walked in as a noble, and it wasn't that you bought the nicest clothes so you got to be the king. It was that the people who performed things got rewarded for them inside the context of the SCA. And for me anyways, I don't think that could be emphasized enough. Now, whether award culture is a good thing or a bad thing, I think a merit culture is something we can all agree on is a powerful thing that makes nerddom in general pretty cool, but makes SCA as our particular corner of nerddom especially cool. So there's a series of events that take place after that I find kind of interesting in terms of the structure of the SCA. So after the first event, everyone said, this is fun, we should do it again. Oh, and do we all know the genesis of the name, the Society for Creative Anachronism? So they had the first event and it was awesome, and everyone said, let's do it again. So they decided they should do it in a public park. And the people who were the autocrats, Elfrida and Walter of Greenwalls, they had to go to the Parks Board to get a permit. And in Berkeley at that time, to get a permit from the Parks Board, you had to have a group, and your group had to have a name. And so the Parks Ranger said, what's the group's name? And Elfrida said, the Society for Creative Anachronism. And she, just like the first party, she thought this was a thing that was going to go on one form and never be mentioned again. But of course it caught on, and here we are years later. I'm still doing the same thing. So after that, they had several events. And at some point, they decided that they were going to have kings. So they just started referring to the guy who'd won as the king. At the first event, there was no such thing as a king. The winner got to crown the lady who inspired him, the Queen of Love and Beauty. But the notion that the person who won that would have any authority or status was completely not relevant. It was a republic, and everyone just sort of made decisions collectively, surprisingly enough, in the 60s in Berkeley. And so this notion of it being a monarchy sort of slowly evolved, and people referred to that person as a king. And at some point, one of the kings wanted to make a decision. I forget the actual story. And some other knight said, "You're the king, just tell us what to do. The king's word is law," which is where that idea came from. But at some point, and this was still in AS1 in the fourth tourney, they decided they were going to do a coronation. So when you won the tournament, there was only one tournament. When you won the tournament, you were going to be crowned by the king. And so Fulk de Wivern was going to crown Henrik of Houn. And before he did so, he asked him to kneel, and he knighted him. And so this was the second knighting in the SCA, and it entrenched this idea of sort of a linear thing. After Henrik is knighted, he knights William the Silent. And then this is the big one. In 12th night of AS2 in January, the William the Silent, who's the third knight of the SCA, gathers all the people who are sort of the current top crop of fighters and has a mass knighting. And this sort of entrenches the notion of knighthood as an order which means something. And so he knighted Bella of Eastmark, Fulk de Wivern, Jamie of Oakenshield, Karl von Ack, Carry the Rock, Siegfried von Hofflichkeit, and Stephen McCuenrig. And I find this super interesting because two of those people you may notice are Siegfried, who was the guy who did the first knighting. So this is knighthood coming the full circle. And then Fulk, who was the first person to knight a king. So there's this real sort of sense of completion in this mass knighting in AS2. That was also the time they instituted the Order of the Laurel. I always forget one of these people, and I feel really bad about it. There were two laurels made. One of them was Master Beverly Hogshead, who was one of the people at the first event. Also, notably, the inventor of the portable hole. And the other guy was a bard who, now I feel bad. Well, I've been recorded for forgetting his name. Leslie, do you know the first laurel? The first one? Okay. Come on, it was only like 50 years ago. You can't remember everyone's name? Jeez, man. You're muted. You're muted. I can't hear you. Okay.
No, I can't remember. I have some memory loss from chemo, so I could barely remember who I went to high school with.
I have some memory loss from having a terrible memory, so I'm right there with you. Okay. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so at the end of the first year, they had 4 events. At the end of the second year, they had 9 events, and it looked like it was going to be a going proposition. And the really big thing that sort of made the SCA explode, I gather, was in '68, Worldcon happened in San Francisco. So it was this giant nerd festival, and all the people who were in the SCA put together a booklet, which was the Guide to the Current Middle Ages, which had, amongst other things, instructions on how to create your own branch. And so this was the thing. All the people who went to Worldcon gathered up these books, went their scattered ways, and started building up branches all over the place. And that was sort of the real moment that the SCA metastasized. And now, of course, it's huge. We have 20 kingdoms. We have thousands of members all over the world, and everything's all over the place. It occurred to me like 5 minutes before I logged on that I should have made a handout for you guys so you could have all this stuff. I didn't though, so you can either write these down or ask me for my lecture notes or not bother, which is all good. Okay, so AS1 in May '96, that was their first event. And it was just the next year that there were events in Three Mountains and Madrone. So Madrone was sort of the early areas that that sort of founded the SCA in An Tir. And it wasn't that long after that, in AS8, so after they'd only been around for a couple of years, they decided that they had enough people to make themselves a principality. And so they had a tournament of union. They actually hadn't gotten agreement from the bod yet that they were going to get principality status, but they talked to the king. The king was okay with it. It was Paul. And so they just decided to go ahead and have their tournament of union. And while the tournament was happening, I gather the word came from the bod that they were indeed allowed to become a principality. So ironically, in AS9, Another con was the impetus to start having events in this area. And some people from An Tir came up, and Bjorn of Havoc and a bunch of other people discovered the SCA and thought it was cool. Now, I'm not 100% clear about the linear timeline here, because there's this great story about Bjorn. Bjorn of Havoc, who was one of the very early people in the SCA, had heard about the SCA, thought it sounded super cool, and he found out that they were using rattan for their weapons. And so he went to the rattan store, and rattan, I'm sure we're all familiar with rattan furniture, where that's woven out of those little thin withies. They gave him this bundle of stringy whippy things, and he said, okay. And so he braided them into what he thought was a sword. And apparently those things were just incredibly dangerous. So you'd throw a snap and somebody would block it, and it would just whip right around the shield and smack you in the other ass cheek, moving like a bajillion miles an hour. And that apparently was completely horrible. Bjorn was really influential in the early days of the SCA. I remember I was talking to Morgan of Aberystwyth a little while ago, and he told me that sort of his first event, there was, I don't remember the actual site, somebody else might know this, there's an incinerator on the North Shore that sort of works like a little castle that we used to have a lot of events at. It has a bunch of imports, and it's sort of a nice round thing, feels like a keep. And they used to have a lot of events over there. And Morgan, who was a high school kid, had heard about this thing and sort of walked up, and there was Bjorn with like 3 helmets and 4 swords and 2 shields. And he said, grab some stuff, go out and start hitting people. And it was this completely mad bunch of young people with absolutely zero safety concerns or anything else, just going and smashing each other crazy.
I think that was at Kate's Park
Was it Kate's
over
Park?
by Deep Cove.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
it's
think
Kate's
you're
Park.
The old
right.
burner, the old there was the base to the burner.
Yeah.
That was about, I guess, about 6 feet tall. That was real fun to fall off of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the one. Yeah.
It had good sally ports, I remember. Is that still there, the burner, or did they get rid of
I
it?
have no idea. I haven't been there in ages.
Yeah,
But yeah, it had 2 sally ports, I think, because that's
Yeah.
where they used to feed the burner from.
right.
And we used to crawl through that and get killed a lot.
I'm pretty sure it's still there.
Yeah.
It was a terrible castle because it was essentially impregnable. So like if you had 6 people inside, you could have 100 people outside, and there was no way you couldn't climb over it. The wall was too high. The sally ports were death traps, and there was no gate to rush. So yes, the good old days. I have fond memories of the events there, but not any fond memories of actually fighting inside that cursed castle, I confess. So the first event in LionsGate was a Montbougan Midwinter Festival that was held in the gym out at UBC. The Monbogs, does anyone remember the Monbogs? I do. Bulwark used to talk about them, but I don't actually remember who they were.
Ilka, he was Ilka the Crazed at the time.
Right.
I can picture faces. Oh, bugger.
Was Alexander in that group?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And probably Ducky if Ilka was. Cool.
And Sylvia Skeen, and I'm trying to remember her SCA name, and I can't. But yes.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so there was a bunch of Monbogs, and they had the thing there, and it was only a month later that we had the first Crown event here. So things zipped right along in those days. Boy. This has nothing to do with LionsGate as such, but I think it's worth noting that there was a bunch of talk in the early days, and it's kind of hard to believe this in a hippie organization about whether it was going to be okay for women to fight or not. And it's like, I constantly have to remind myself when I'm thinking about this, it was the 70s. There were lots of guys who grew up in the 50s with these very old world ideas about striking women, which I suppose are positive in their own way. Yeah, Leslie? Oh, you're muted.
And as I recall, a lot of the age group, the women were having young children or pregnant, and it just wasn't an issue at that time for that reason.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. But there were some people who wanted to fight. I've heard that there were a bunch of women who were fencers. Diana was a fencer, I gather. And so there were people who wanted to get into fighting. And of course, at the time, it was super dangerous because really, like if you were wearing leather gloves, you were considered to be heavily armored, right? And so there was some debate about whether it was going to be okay or not. And the bod, really for the least noble reason possible, the bod that used to be called the Imperium back in the old days, put an announcement saying, if we don't let women fight, we're going to lose our tax exempt status. So you can't tell women they're not allowed to fight.
However, even into the 80s, I do recall being one of the few women fighters on the field, had men fighters refuse to fight me.
Well, and right in here it says the board reaffirms the right of any fighter implied in bylaws number 12 to refuse to fight without dishonor. Which, yes.
Yeah, it was really hostile.
I was gonna start on a rant on that. I gather it's still hostile in lots of parts of the world, so
Yes.
I'm not sure how people feel about that, but yeah.
I want to fight him. That's how I feel about it.
You do or you don't.
Do.
I just want to take him out back and smack him is what I want to do. Gerhard Kendall used to have a great story that I don't remember the king he was talking about, but there was some debate about whether women were going to fight or not. And there was lots of debate leading up to the crown tournament, and the king stands up and says, I've thought about this for a long time, and I've taken counsel with my knights, and I've decided that there will be no female fighters on the field today. And there's this gasp that runs through the crowd. And he says, and there will be no male fighters on the field this day. And everyone says, hmm? He says, there are only going to be fighters on the field today. And everyone cheers, and it's really lovely. Which is a great story. And it turns out that Kendall made that up, and it's probably totally not true, because I've asked everybody I can find about this, and literally 0 people can remember that happening. And Kendall never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So all evidence suggests that is in fact a completely made up story, but even knowing that it's totally fake, when I tell it, it makes me cry. So I think that's a beautiful, beautiful, if completely spurious piece of SCA history. So not long after that, Lionsgate becomes a barony, and then this very exciting thing happened, which I only learned about relatively recently, which was the An Tir Rebellion, which never gets talked about, and I think it should get talked about way more often. So An Tir was very far away from the center of the West. It took a long time to drive from An Tir all the way down to the Bay Area, where most of the Crown events happened. And a lot of the people in An Tir felt really alienated from the central part of the SCA. They felt alienated because royalty didn't come up very often. They felt alienated because people weren't getting awards very often. They felt alienated because often an officer would get their warrant, do their entire office, their entire term, and then quit and hand the office off to someone else without ever getting any official recognition from Kingdom that they were in fact in that office. And of course, this was all in the days of snail mail and so on. So like it was long and complicated. Now there's a bunch of debate about whether that has anything to do with the Kingdom of the West being a bunch of jerk faces who didn't actually pay attention to An Tir, or whether it's just that we were very, very far away, and in the days of mail, everything took a super long time and we were a bunch of hippies and things weren't super organized. But regardless, there was this growing sense of disenfranchisement in An Tir. And it got bad enough that people decided they were going to start thinking about splitting off from the SCA. And so there was this movement to make An Tir independent. Some people actually went to the extent of looking into the legality of starting a smaller organization called the NSCA, incorporating it, breaking from the SCA Inc., and just becoming a completely separate but parallel organization. So it didn't quite get to that point. What happened was that Edward Zifron won coronet and became the prince. And he was a rebel. He was part of the Rebel Alliance. Star Wars had just come out, so there was lots of talk of the Rebel Alliance. So he was part of the Rebel Alliance, and he said, right, I'm just going to get some crowns. I'm going to declare An Tir a rebel state, and I'm just going to say that we're a kingdom now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to crown myself at the coronation of my successor, and then I'll turn right around and I'll crown my successor. The guy who won next was Manfred Kriegstreiber, who's over there on the right. And this was the big plan. The plan, however, was leaked, and Gerhard Kendall found out about it. And this sort of speaks back to that first thing I was talking about, where I was saying that in these days, people talked a lot about how when you were in the SCA, you weren't a modern person pretending to be a medieval person. You were embodying those ideals, right? And so Kendall, being a royalist, took his fealty oath seriously. So he felt it was his responsibility as a knight of the West to go and pass on this treasonous talk to his king, King Paul. So he did that. He went down, and Paul was apparently apoplectic, which, if you know anything about Paul, is not terribly surprising. Oh, I said that on recording. We can edit that out. I can fix that in post. Well, Paul was mad because Paul had considered himself a great friend of An Tir. He thought he was personal friends with many of the rebels. He had named An Tir a principality. He was the person who came up to the Tournament of Unity. He loved this place. He had really deep ties in An Tir. And so he felt that it was a personal betrayal. And he felt like, why didn't you come and tell me? If there were all these problems, why am I finding out about it from a rebellious rabble rather than from someone picking up the phone and saying, hey, Paul, there's problems up here. Can you come and help us with them? And so he was enraged. So he made Theodulf of Madrona and Kendall viceroys and appointed them sort of officers of the crown. And I'm not actually sure what if there was a process for this, but he called An Tir a rebellious state, and it was somehow sort of demoted from genuine principality to rebellious principality. I have to find out what the actual bureaucratic parts of that are. I'm just going to make a note. Okay. So things were coming to a head as we moved towards coronation. Zifron was still planning on doing this whole thing. Kendall and Theodulf were looking over his shoulder. Paul was breathing fire from California, and tensions were high. So coronation comes, and the Rebel Alliance had decided that they were going to wear gray armbands because that was An Tir skies proper. And the royalists, the people who supported the crown, were going to wear purple armbands because they found out about this whole armband thing, and they were going to do the opposite. And so they were wearing purple to support the West, but also, of course, those are royalist colors. And so they show up at Coronet, and there's Zifron and Montfort looking out over the crowd, and all they see is like a sea of purple and gray with no clear majority. And it's absolutely clear that this is going to be terribly divisive. There's going to be no good ending to it, and everything's going to end poorly. So before the actual ceremony, there is apparently furious backroom conversations, and everybody's trying to argue for everybody. And in the end, a bunch of people convince Zifron that being part of a small independent organization is not going to be as good as remaining part of the larger organization of the SCA. That it just is going to be impractical to have that cross-border organization, and everything's going to be problematic. So sort of at the 11th hour, right before court starts, he concedes that maybe it's not the best idea. So he goes up, they hold court, and somebody comes up to him with the crowns and presents them. These are the crowns of An Tir, and I'm giving them to the king of An Tir. And Montfort accepts them and says, I'll hold them in abeyance for the first king, and puts them to the side. So he's not willing to actually accept them. And the irony is, 4 years later, once these people work all this business out and An Tir becomes a kingdom, the first king is, it's Montfort, that's right. So the very person who turned down the crowns as a rebellious prince ended up being the person who was the first king of An Tir. I love this story for a pile of reasons. I love that in many ways it illustrates the crazy zaniness that was the SCA of the early days. The notion that you could just declare yourself a rebel state and say, I'm no longer a part of the West, I'm just going to call myself an independent kingdom, it's cool, but like nobody would think of that now. I was trying really hard when the borders were closed. I was trying to convince everybody I could think of to have a rebellion south of the border. I thought it would have been great if they just held the crown tournament in Seattle and declared a king, and then Christian could have been really mad and not done anything about it, and they could have been really mad and not come up and invaded. And then when the borders open, we could have a war and everything would be great, and we could reunite and there'd be a big party. And nobody would go for it because everyone was saying like, well, what the bod? What Kapora? How could, no, we can't do that. That's how, no. And so the idea that the SCA, there was a time when it was that wacky, is very exciting to me. But it's also funny to think how close we came. We came like one conversation away from An Tir not being part of the SCA anymore, being some other thing, being some, like it'd be like AmpGuard and all those other organizations that we have. And so I love that as sort of this really intriguing near miss, sort of this Gallipoli-like kind of story. But the thing that I think makes me the most amused about it is as sort of a wide-eyed historian of the great man school, it's tempting to see this in sort of this great big heroic personalities in conflict. But ultimately, the thing that made the decision wasn't the great big personalities. It was going to be a bureaucratic nightmare to have the NSCA be an independent organization. And so ultimately, it was kind of all this paperwork that made the decision in the end anyways. So that amuses me. I have a note in here in this timeline which really has no place in here, because for the most part these dates are sort of the big nation-making dates that sort of define the shape of the kingdom. And I should have a slide for this, but I couldn't find a good one. There's a great story about Steingrim and Janeltus, and this is a story that I think the newer generations of Ontarians are less versant in Janeltus lore. But people of my generation hold her very dear. Sort of the Kendalls and Janeltus hold a very outsized place in the hearts of Northern An Tir. There are two very cool things about the story of Steingrim and Janeltus. So Steingrim, who had been king of the West when he came to fight as a prince of An Tir, entered the lists, and by ancient tradition in the West, you don't need to declare your consort unless you win. You can enter with a secret consort. And so he said, as a king of the West, I choose to enact that tradition, and I won't tell anyone who I'm fighting for. And he won, and he went into the crowd, and he brought out Janeltus, who was quite elderly at the time, and I met her once for 12 seconds. I didn't actually know her at all, but she was wildly, wildly popular, and it was apparently the place just exploded with glee at the notion of her being their princess. But this too is one of those crazy things that sort of I think is less likely to happen now in sort of the world of us having an actual organization with rules and communication lines and so on. When they stepped down, Janeltus was so wildly popular as a princess that someone petitioned the bod to make her princess in perpetuity. And so she was the dowager princess because they decided she was so keen we wanted to have somebody as a perpetual stand-in for that sort of matronly role of princess. And I don't know if, again, if this is me not paying attention, but the idea of that sort of weird, wacky, zany things coming out of left fieldiness is something that I find really exciting about that era of the SCA. It's like there was a real sense that anything could happen all the time. That was very neat. And the rest of the dates are not especially interesting, but sort of worth noting in sort of the arc of the SCA. The Summits was created as a principality. Avocall was created as a principality, and then Tir, and then Avocall split, and now who knows what's happening with Tir. So that is the exciting timeline of Ontarian history as I see it. Sorry, my bias is very much for the first decade of the SCA, so I don't have a lot to say about the modern stuff, really. I asked around a bunch, actually, to find out if there was any exciting drama or anything in any of those principalities happening. Everyone said, nope, we just decided it was time and we had enough people, so we did it. There you go. Okie doke.
Can I just take this point to say I did get the links for if you want tutor credit for this. The link is in the chat for you to sign up, and also if you could fill out a feedback for the course, that would be great. And I do have a link for you, Sir Antonio, as well as an instructor, and I'll send that to you.
Can everyone see that? Do you want me to unshare the screen for a while so you can check out the chat and link to everything? No, we're all good? Okay. So from here on, I mostly have sort of a series of definitional stuff. So what I would like to do is go through these things, and rather than having me define them for you, which would be the epitome of boring, although I have a bunch of random things I want to throw into ideas, I'm hoping we can sort of see how we do on them. So I'm hoping that you guys can just tell me sort of what are the qualities of these things, and we'll just run through a big series of terms and define them collectively. So feel free to unmute yourself and just start shouting stuff out. What makes a kingdom in the SCA?
There's a royalty structure.
It has a king.
Although not necessarily.
It could be a queen and a queen.
Could be a
Yes.
queen. It could be a queen and a queen. It has, well, we'll say it has a sovereign. Yeah, it also has at least 400 people because we're a bureaucracy and we have to have numbers. And I don't know if this is still true. It used to be for a long time that there had to be some clear geographical reason to divide regions. So I'm not sure if they maintain that now, but you couldn't just arbitrarily split a barony in half because you didn't like the other half of the people or something like that. Principalities. Oops. My computer's moving super fast, so there's a little lag.
They also have a royalty structure.
It's like Kingdom Light.
Yeah.
They also have a numerical requirement, which is only 100 people. So this is paid members. I think the usual guess is that there's between 2 and 4 times more members than there are paid members. So I think they're assuming that that's a goodly number of people. Along with principalities, we have regions. Does anyone have any idea what a region is inside the SCA context?
It's like the inlands region of An Tir, is it not?
It's exactly like that. Do you know what makes the inlands region a region rather than a principality?
No.
It's basically just an administrative line that is drawn around it. It's often before somebody becomes a principality, it gets lumped together as a region to say these people are a cohesive political unit, but they're not organized yet enough to sort of become their own thing.
Okay.
It's an administrative region that may or may not ever actually become a principality.
I think by and large, the intention is to lump them together for some efficient reason. So when Avakal sort of was pre-principality, it was like, well, all those people on the other side of the mountain are all doing stuff together. So the Kingdom Seneschal said, we'll make that a cohesive unit because it's easier on me in terms of paperwork. Baronies, it took me the longest time to get the difference between baronies and cantons and shires and whatnot. Anyone want to guess what a barony is?
Is it like 60 paid members?
It's much lower. It's 25.
Oh, really? Okay, that's something new.
Paid members.
Yeah, they're paid. So that is the big difference, right? It's getting the people to cough up the big bucks. That's what makes a big difference there. But it's also, you still have to go through the whole kingdom hoo-ha of getting approved by the kingdom and getting a baron and having elections and setting your officers up and so on. So this is kind of by the by in terms of the actual definitions of this. But if you were thinking to yourself, oh, good heavens, I could start a barony, it is also getting all that administrative stuff in place so that there's a stable officer corps and so on is the thing they're going to want to see.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity, does a shire need a seneschal?
Yes.
Kevin might be able to say this, but I'm pretty sure it does. I think a seneschal is the essential thing for basically every stable organization. The seneschal is the chief administrative officer.
Yeah.
Like the branch president.
Yeah, right up until you get a baron. So for all those small groups, the seneschal is the most essential officer.
Okay.
Seneschal and exchequer. There's 5, I think. Seneschal, exchequer. Oh bugger, I have to look it up.
I was just talking.
Your basic offices are seneschal, exchequer, and then a combination of stables, herald, arts and sciences. I think are sort of the basic you need for a shire, for example. And the thing that makes a canton is the fact that it's being supported by a barony. So the requirements are a little wider for a canton because they're getting helped.
Wouldn't Shadlane also be in there?
Chatelaine is ideal. I don't believe it's a required.
Okay.
It's a nice to have. It's not a
Yeah.
must have.
There's a C in Seneschal, Sir Antonio.
I typed one. I think I backed out over it. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so those are the greater officers. The lesser officers are the ones on top of that. So I think we've already answered what shires and cantons are. A canton is a place that is under the support of a baron, a barony. And then I don't think I see these very often here. I don't know if this is colleges are associated with educational institutions. Strongholds and ports are things that I have never actually encountered. Has anyone ever come across one of those?
The military base in Victoria, the naval base used to be Crookston.
Oh, okay.
It was a port.
Yeah, so ports and strongholds are military bases. Ports in particular are things that you expect to have a lot of your people away from the actual place and out and about a whole bunch. So you can have sort of members at large who are associated with a particular organization. So that's a way to sort of solve that problem.
I think the Nimitz was a barony at one point.
Oh, funny.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem with that would be like the stable population, right? Because I would have to assume that people would move in and out of that fairly often.
But they maintained it enough that they got baronial status
That's
for
hilarious.
a number of years. Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
I'm going to skip some of these and talk about households. Households are interesting because they, in all of the literature I looked at preparatory to this, the information about households was the same. It's at an informal gathering of people that has no particular status in the SCA. And all of the handbooks going all the way back to 75 emphasize this notion that there was no official recognition of households as households. And there are two reasons I find that groovy. The first one is, especially if you travel back east, there are people who think of themselves more specifically as members of their household than of their kingdom. And so it's intriguing to me that there's like this clearly an overt desire by the SCA to not recognize households as part of the structure. Well, in reality, that is not at all what happens. But also, I was looking through a while ago some of the old Northwinds, which are the old newsletters for LionsGate, for those of you who haven't been around long enough to know what that is. And I came across a letter from Bjorn, I think, Bjorn of Havoc, arguing that giving the Baron all of the power in the barony and taking it away from the heads of households was actually leading to a tyrannous state. And so apparently at some point there was some debate over whether the main power in the barony ought to cede with the Baron or whether it ought to cede with a council of the heads of what he called the greater households. I have no idea how he was defining that term. But again, like the An Tir Rebellion, where clearly there was this moment where the SCA could have either been a fractured thing where every kingdom was its own organization or a unified thing where we were all together. It seems like there was a moment when the baronial power structure could easily have become this sort of weird sort of democracy in the sense of a Greek democracy where everybody who's white male and over 40 gets a vote. Yeah, which I find super interesting that there was almost this completely different structure of power and organization. Okay,
It's like a Norse sort of conclave of jarls under the sort of, I think that's where he was going with that.
Yeah, but I mean, but that structure is recapitulated over and over and over again throughout history, right? If you think about like the
Yeah.
city-states of Italy and the or even the households of Italy, you think about like all of, I guess this is sort of like Norse, but like all of France and England was like nominally under a king, but realistically it was all under the hands of the barons anyways, right? So it was always this sort of weirdly diverse power structure in the Middle Ages. It was very rare to have sort of a sun king who had sort of all the power. And I think the notion we have of that sort of like king being the single repository of all political power and all power flowing out from that person, rather than politics being a weirdly decentralized thing.
Very Victorian.
Very Victorian, exactly what I was going to say. It's that
Yeah.
Victorian overlay over a misconstrued sense of what the Middle Ages was.
I'd love to see households become more officially recognized, because I think that would be kind of cool, but that's just me.
Yeah, I'm really ambivalent about it. And sorry, that has nothing to do with the course. So hopefully it's okay that we're going off on these crazy rambly digressions. I'm of two minds about it, because on the one hand, that would be a very cool subversion of a very linear power structure. And I think,
Yeah.
as I keep saying, decentralizing power is 100% period, right? On the other hand, and this is going to be totally paternalistic of me to say, like, there's just no control over what happens there. So when we have things like those jerks putting their swastikas on their clothes and saying, what is period? If you have that kind of decentralized power structure where any Yahoo can gather enough people together and make a great household and then gain power in a way where there's no recourse to any other official power structure, there is some potential danger in an organization like that. So
Yeah, that's not necessarily what I meant. It was more like kind of more ceremonial, you know?
yeah. Well, I think
kind of add more flair to our game. I think that'd be kind of cool, but that was just kind of where I was going.
oh, for
I
sure.
totally
Well,
get what you're saying too. So
and there's a very Game of Thronesy kind of, it would be cool to say it like, or Harry Potter houses, right, where you're sort of like you're associated with this organization that defines you in some way. And I do feel like that would be cool, but also that the SCA allows that very much, right? It says there's no official political structure called the household that has any special authority one way or the other, but that in no way actually denies you the right to sort of build the household of that sort. And those have come and gone, right? I mean, the Gucci's were a big household. Darius had his whole thing going on with the Roman Legion. So we've seen big households come and go. The Varangians dominated An Tir for 20 years there in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, if I could just chime in here, I've been at like a number of crowns and things where households have their areas segregated and roped off, and you get the feeling that you're not allowed in their territory at all. You can't stop by and say hi. It's almost like you're not integrating with the greater community if the household is like that. That's just an observation that I have on it.
I 100% agree. The first time I went to Pennsic, I was and this is what I was saying back east, the households are very dominant. The first time I went to Pennsic, I was gobsmacked, and you'd walk down this road and it would be just like walled encampment after walled encampment after walled encampment. It was like walking down the street in like the seedier parts of New York City. It's like very hostile. And coming from An Tir, where it was like, we kind of have roads in theory, but like really you just kind of go wherever. It was very interesting. And I have noticed that An Tir has moved more that direction, both in terms of like organized routes for travel, but also more and more people are roping off their encampments. And I have to say, and I have no idea, I can't speak to you, Miles, but I'm really a shy person, weirdly. And so for me, I find that, I know it's hard to believe, but I am. So I find that off-putting, and I can never tell if that's me being defensive or if that is in fact that it's a hostile situation. It's like, I don't know, I'm gonna have to go talk to strangers and they're over there. If they don't like me, I'll have to walk all the way back here in shame.
I think whether it is hostile or not, you still get that impression.
Yeah.
But I think households in our area aren't as great as they were probably in the 1980s or something.
What is, Miles? The world's going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
Why in my day?
Yeah, well, I think, it probably peaked and then kind of is in the valley, but it's still there.
Yep.
But I don't think it's as important to people to become part of a household anymore.
Yep.
I think, well, I mean, people are, you're attached to a knight, or you're attached to a laurel, or you're attached to a pelican or something like that. They tend to be more like that in our area anyway.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot to be said for that, because that's a direct line to the crown, and it's a more cohesion building social structure, right? Where if you're associated with a knight who's associated to the crown, and someone else is associated to a knight who's associated to the crown, like we're all gathering together as we move up that hierarchy, rather than households which split us apart, right?
Yeah. My thoughts anyway.
I agree completely. Okay, so apparently this class is actually turned into internal politics of An Tir as it relates to a household structure rather than anything else. So there you go. I'm glad we're recording this so everyone has evidence of my incredible class planning. So let's run through the same thing with the royalty. I think this is all super obvious, and we don't need to actually cover it, so it'll go really fast. Kings and queens, we know they're the kings and queens. We know why they're kings and queens because they have won a crown. And of course, we address the kings and queen as
Your Majesty.
Your Majesty. You probably all know this. In period, there was no standard form of address for kings. So I keep reading historical accounts and they're talking to the king as Your Grace. It's like, Your Grace, that's a duke. Oh, right. And again, this is super Victorian, right? The Victorians had this really rigid series of titles that you used for nobility, and we've just borrowed the British version, of course. And the regalia of those is pretty easy. Crown Prince and Princess. Their title is Prince and Princess. The form of address is
Your Royal Highness.
And of course, that's often truncated just as Your Highness. And territorial.
Isn't Your Royal Highness for the heir to the throne?
Yes. The Crown Prince and Princess is indeed the heir to the throne. Have I got that terminology wrong? Is it not?
No, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. Had me scared there for a second. We know, Nirgwe, that you're these Western ways are foreign to you, so you might struggle with them. Oh, I'm glad I got that on recording, so I could be totally embarrassed by that.
Your Excellency, are you also going to be talking about the regalia? Because there's specific sumptuary laws for these.
I will after this, but the monarchs, the regalia is so straightforward that it's pretty straightforward. There's only one crown, so it's not especially unique, right? Or it's not something we need to identify clearly.
Fair.
The territorial princes and princesses. That would be the prince and princesses who are not heir to the throne.
Oh, Your Highness.
Yeah. Cool. And the regalia, of course, is the crowns of their areas. All right, so here's where we actually start caring about regalia. A duke and duchess are a duke and duchess because they have done what?
One crown more than twice.
Ooh, it's actually that they have reigned more than twice, because we have at least one person in the
Right.
kingdom who has won crown 3 times, but only reigned twice.
I forgot about that word.
It's a rarity, but it does happen that people win crown and don't step up, and you don't actually become a duke for not having stepped up. And we call those people.
Your Grace.
And what is the reserve sumptuary for a duke or duchess?
This I don't know.
Oak leaves.
It's a circlet. It's not oak leaves, actually.
Or
Strawberry
it's
leaves.
strawberry.
Strawberry leaves.
Yes.
They do look suspiciously oaky, I confess. A county is somebody who has what?
Reigned once as king or queen.
And we address them as
Your Excellency?
if you're ever not sure what to call someone with a metal hat in the SCA, go for Your Excellency, because 80% of the time you're correct. That seems to be the catch-all phrase that gets used. A county coronet.
I don't know.
Does anyone know?
Is this one the oak leaves?
No, there are no oak leaves, weirdly.
Okay.
No, that's actually a mundane thing I've been reading up on.
Yeah.
I got
A county is crenellated, right?
Yeah, it is crenellated. It's usually called embattled. And a viscounty. What has a viscount or viscountess done?
Reigned once or more as territorial prince princess.
Form of address.
Your Excellency.
It's going to be Your Excellency from here on down, so everybody else is Your Excellency. And the regalia.
I don't know that one.
Kevin, do you know?
This is the one that's pointed, but not with pearl leaves, or no, the pearl's on baronial. So this is
See you tomorrow.
something of a certain height or a certain number of points.
There's actually no standard. So they say there you can use a 3-pointed coronet, but there's actually no standard.
Yeah, this sort of level, it's more like don't do something higher.
Yeah.
Right.
Because there are very few undifferentiated coronets, right? All of them have something attached to it. In a viscounty, because it's the step after. Oh, I'm such a bad courtier.
Yeah. Well, maybe they should use Oakleys for this one, because clearly that's a cool thing that we should all use. It's available. Territorial Baron is, of course, Your Excellency, because everybody's Your Excellency. And the regalia for a Baron.
Isn't that the one with pearls?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pearls. Four pearls?
Is there? I don't think there's a number.
There's no
actually.
set number. It's
Yeah.
just points
Is
with
there?
pearls.
Just pearls, yeah.
As many as you want.
Oddly enough, I think it's something like 8, so that it doesn't start to look like a coronet, like a principality coronet.
Ooh, really?
Is it-
I was just looking
There's
on the heraldry
something-
site and it didn't specify a number, so I don't know if there's some arcane thing that tells you what number it is.
But
My
there is,
study guide doesn't have a number, so.
if we're talking territorial, there's something that is on all of them though, and it's the branch crest.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Is that required, or is that just that is on there?
I've never seen one that didn't have it.
Nor have I, but I don't think it's. I think that's actually an optional thing.
Hmm.
I mean, it's the same thing. Like all the crowns have typically the whatever the main charge on the device on the crowns, but I don't think they're required to. I think that's just a convenient way to identify them. Yeah, and of course, my favorite court barony is weirdly exactly the same as a real baron, even though they do no actual work. Bunch of lazy buggers.
The only difference is they don't have the baronial crest on them.
Right, right.
Yeah, I think mine has got 6 pearls. I think.
Mine has good intentions and has for many years.
I haven't worn it for a while, but I think it's got 6.
I've been meaning to get one for years and haven't. So yeah, it's good for having us talk. I could have had the wrong number. That could have been frustrating. Okay, let's quickly run down the officers. We talked about these already, but we didn't actually talk about what they did. So it's probably good to define them. The Seneschal's job is
Basically branch president and everything legal.
also sort of the circus wrangler, right? They're usually the person who
In charge kind of thing.
Also dumping everything possible that you don't want to do onto them.
Yeah.
that sounds about right.
Poor Kevin.
Kevin agrees.
Oh.
The Exchequer, I quite like this this device.
The math bank person.
Bit of financial
Bank person,
responsibility.
Accountant.
Treasure, whatever you want to call it.
or
Bean
going by their
counter.
arms, Chief Gucci, Chief Temporary Gucci player. Sorry, what was that, Leslie?
Bean counter.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Chief financial officer.
The Chamberlain doesn't have arms, so I had to improvise.
You don't even know what the Chamberlain is. We've never
They
heard
keep
of that.
track of the stuff, the regalia,
Oh, like
the
quartermaster.
yeah, everything that's owned by the barony, shire, or kingdom.
They are in fact apparently called the quartermaster in some places. So yeah. Yes, the Chamberlain. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The Herald. Heralds are such a dumb office, and I love how dumb they are because it's super historical. But man, the two jobs they have are like bear no relationship to each other.
So I know one of the jobs is be loud and heard in court.
So they do all the public talky stuff. They have a second job which is really important.
Helping register devices and names. And they're supposed to be like the massive nerds in society on that one subject.
I was
And
gonna say,
keep track of if they can read, yes. And they keep track of the book of ceremony, like the stuff.
The ceremonies, yeah.
My brain's dying.
all the talky and other collecty stuff.
Ooh, my job, yay.
Marshal's pretty clear, right? It's the person who takes care of the fighting stuff.
Yeah, I'm the branch marshal out here.
That explains why you don't know what any of the other officers do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that too, having been one, is also marshals, the marshalette, making sure you've got enough senior marshals or junior marshals or.
I'm
that kind of
technically the
stuff.
only marshal in my shire, and I'm a junior. But I'm still able to hold the office according to the Earl Marshal.
Yeah. Also lists. I think lists comes under marshalette, doesn't it?
I don't
It
know.
does. It
Oh,
does,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's a separate office, right?
It's a separate office, but it's a sub office of the marshal.
Is it?
Yeah, I'm glad you're learning that, as that's your office.
Iron Key.
Yeah.
They do Iron Key too, right?
Is it? Is that my job? Cool. Okay, that's less. Chronicler.
Does nothing.
Okay, we have that on record. You know,
Is this
Maybe that's
the
your Barno
archivist
privilege
as well?
there.
I think the archivist is different, is it? But the chronicler is the person who keeps track of the newsletter and so on.
Yeah.
It's supposed to
There's-
keep track of the newsletter, and I think underneath that is the sub that the keeps, someone has the notes for the monthly meetings for the council meetings, and it gets published as such.
And
Is-
Westminster is a new office under that, and also is social media officer.
Right. It's interesting. Again, this is a bunch of the people in this meeting will know this stuff, but for the newer people, I remember how absolutely critical the newsletters used to be. Like especially over the winter months where there wasn't that many events and you didn't have Facebook, so you weren't keeping in touch with people. Like all of the doings of the barony, the political back squabbles, what the baron wanted you to know, all that stuff. Like you would eagerly look forward to the monthly newsletter and read it. And it had, recipes and funny stories. And of course, we didn't have the internet. So like all of the research that people were doing, you got it in these tiny little dribs and drabs. I was talking a while ago to Mersha about how, and she was saying she misses the days when like you'd be driving to Portland, and so you'd stop off at someone's house, and what you would do is you'd bring your favorite 10 books and you would sit down and they would give you their favorite 10 books, and you'd all like frantically take notes on the things you really, really liked. And it was this very sort of FUBU, it was almost like medieval monks copying stuff out, right? And you sort of like the information just sort of leaked in such a slow and organic way. And so I think the chronicler is an interesting job that has sort of lost a lot of its status now that like we just have a web page, right? The chronicle, like I confess I don't read the crier as often as I should. Leslie, just interrupt me. Don't even wait.
At the At the beginning, definitely the newsletter was everything. Unless you were at an event talking to people, you had to get your information from the newsletter. So it was be all and end all. Are any of them, the old ones, around anymore? Are they archived somewhere?
A bunch of them are archived in various places. So someone just sent me a giant box of Northwinds. The problem with archiving them is that they're not old enough to be past copyright, and there's really bad authorship attribution. And so there's these giant legal problems. I keep meaning to go talk to the librarians at my college and ask them sort of what the deal is on how we can use this stuff and if it's okay to use it and so on. But there are giant legal issues around attribution.
I hate to drag him into this, but my cousin, my foster brother, Nick, who's just moved into Nanaimo, was a law librarian, and he's been around since the early 70s. He might have some help to you in that. I'll tell you after.
I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Can you copy it and have him get in touch with me?
Yeah, just chiming in here on something, because when I first took that office, I wanted to republish some of those old articles. And I was told not to go anywhere near them because of legal reasons.
Yeah.
And all your information is now on Facebook, it's on internet. So, you know, the publication's really kind of redundant.
Yeah, yeah. It's sad though, because I mean, not to be a crotchety old man telling people to get off my lawn. I feel like the role of those newsletters was different than the role of the Facebook page, right? The Facebook page, well, there's two big things that to me are fundamentally different. The first one is the Facebook page is like bite-sized nuggets of really immediate news. And so we don't get, there used to be articles about what research people were doing, and there used to be articles about political doings. There was that argument about whether or not great houses should be the political seat of power in the barony or the barons should. Like, you would never see that on Facebook now, right? It's too bite-sized, and I don't mean that as necessarily bad. It's just it's a different medium, and so it precludes that kind of more interesting conversation.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree, and I should do something about it, but I'm lethargic.
I don't know if you can, because like the stuff that made people get the newsletter was finding out about the upcoming events, and we don't need that anymore because we have Facebook. So convincing people that they want to get it when it's just a couple of random articles by some person is going to be a much harder sell. So I think that moment is just past. I don't think there's anything to do about it.
Yeah, it's
the other thing I find, and again, this is totally a crotchety old man argument. I love Facebook, and I love being able to be more in touch with the SCA and like watch events that I'm not at. And like, I love this, being able to have Bjorn here at this meeting is like super cool. And so the ESCA is awesome. But it's so integrated with my modern life that it's really hard for me to sort of, that thing I keep talking about, where in the old days, we would embody these ideals. If half of my SCA information comes while I'm sitting in my living room and I get some modern news from The Guardian, and then I get an SCA story, and then I get a funny cat meme, and then I get another SCA story, I can't embody that identity because it's always coming to me in a modern format and in my modern sensibilities. And again, I don't think this is good or bad, or I don't think it's possible to turn the clock back on it. I mostly am sad for people who are discovering the SCA now that they don't get the opportunity to have that immersive experience that we had, right?
right. Yeah, I agree.
I can always pull up my phone and check what my kids are doing, and I don't have that sort of inhabiting that space completely for that whole day thing. So apparently this is a class in crotchety old nostalgia. That's what it is. So the ANS minister is pretty straightforward. There's not, we all know what that is. Sorry, Leslie, did you want to say something about crotchety nostalgia?
No. I resemble that remark.
Excellent. Chatelaine?
The newcomers office.
Yes, this one that is increasingly important as we're all uptight about aging out and retention and recruitment and so on.
Like, for me here in the shop in Appledore, like I'm deputy web minister, a master of stables. I'm like half shadowing as well. Cause like I do all the things.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
I
Well-
think like stuff like that goes hand in hand. Like the master stable should kind of be like into like helping recruit, because that's what I do.
Yeah, there's a lot of
That's how I
overlap
get
in
my
those.
fighters.
Yeah, yeah. Lots of overlap for sure. And the scribe is inexplicably different than the chronicler.
I actually don't know what a scribe does.
I was very confused when I had to first figure this stuff out too, because it's like, why is the scribe different than the chronicler? The scribe is a person who's in charge of scrolls and stuff. So they are the more calligraphy kind of. And the web minister is pretty obvious. They're in charge of weaving. They're in charge of the web.
Yeah, they look after the websites and social media.
And that is all the officers we need to worry about. Where are we at? We're 20. Yeah, I think we can go through the stuff. Okay, so let's move on to awards. I think these are all stuff you're going to know, so we should go over this pretty quickly, but let's make sure we're all on the same page just in terms of what's going on. There are 4 levels of awards in the SCA. Does anyone know what they are?
Patent, grant, armigerous, and non-armigerous.
100%. I'm going to do those in reverse order if I may. And I may, because I'm in charge. What the heck am I saying? Okay. Non-armigerous awards, they don't grant the right to bear heraldic arms. I find this very funny in the SCA. There's this notion of granting people the right to bear arms, which is silly because we make virtually no distinction between a device, which is a heraldic thing that you put on your stuff, and arms, which are a device that is recognized by the College of Heralds. Because we don't stop people who are non-armigerous from bearing arms, that distinction becomes very muddy, which is fine. I don't mind. It becomes this very ceremonial distinction, which is like, we all seem to care about it, but it's so completely unimportant in reality. It's only a matter of what we call things. Non-armigerous awards are hilarious to me because some of the lowest ranking awards we have in the SCA are non-armigerous, but also some of the ones that are ultimately, I think, the highest, most important ones are also non-armigerous, which makes that distinction also even more silly. So most baronial awards, for instance, are non-armigerous. I think, I tried to look into this and I couldn't confirm it, but I'm pretty sure all of the principality awards in Tier are non-armigerous. But then there's these really big gun awards that are non-armigerous. So the line of An Tir, which I don't know if this is just because it's one that I really want, to me, this is like, that is the pinnacle of awards in the SCA. It's the king saying, I get one crack to recognize someone I think is super awesome and you're it. That's a pretty big deal. Unique augmentations of arms, which happen very rarely. That's non-armigerous. The Order of the Rose, which is the order you get for stepping down as the consort of sovereign. The Silver Rose, which is the consolation prize for not winning crown. The Silver Lily, which is the consolation prize for being attached to some jerk who got a silver rose. The Iron, does anyone know the Iron Chain? This was a very big deal when it was made, but it's kind of fallen out of favor.
That's someone who actually puts their life at risk, like seriously.
Yeah, it's somebody who risks serious physical harm or death in an SCA context. So a bunch of people rescued a horse that had gotten out and they were given the Iron Chain. It's very rarely given out, luckily, because it requires people to be in grievous bodily danger. And the Honor of the Carp. Do you guys know what the Carp is?
I have one.
This is such a cool award. I love this one. I will never have it. You want to tell us what it is, Sneak?
It's recognition for being in persona. I actually have one of the ones that was embroidered by Lau.
Wow.
Yeah, I looked it up and she only gave out like 5 or 6 of the
Wow.
embroidered ones. So I'm feeling pretty special.
So Lau, if you don't know this, I feel like she's a duchess, but I can only
Yes,
think
she
of the
is.
one time. So Barrack won for her once. Who else was she with? Oh, she was with Dak, of course. Duh. So Lau is famously excellent at embodying her persona. So she has a Chinese persona and will spend entire weekends doing nothing that is not in persona. And so when she was queen the second time, I think, she instituted this award, the Honor of the Carp, for people who embody their persona in some way or another. So some people have gotten it for their incredibly in persona behavior. Some people have gotten it for only having clothes that are for their persona. Some people have gotten it for having an incredibly period encampment, but it's about embodying your persona in some meaningful way. And so these are like really, as I say, big gun awards. So it's kind of funny that they're lumped in with the lowest of the low with the baronial minor. You've been here for 6 months and you have shoes award. An Tir also has a pretty good history of absolutely preposterous non-armigerous awards. These two seem to have gone somewhat out of fashion. There's a string of them, but the two that I most am familiar with are the Order of the Pernicious Lily. Does anyone know what that one is? It's my personal favorite. The Order of the Pernicious Lily was for people who were especially good at dying great dramatic deaths. And so in the old days, there used to be lots of spinning around and giving speeches and singing death dirges and cursing your opponent and flinging off your helmet and vomiting blood and stuff. And now people sort of salute and go, yeah, okay, you win.
I remember the Mucking Tall Mall and the Shattered Shield.
Those are still technically in use, but I gather everyone hates them. So now they're kind of like one of those white elephant awards. The Mucking Tall Mall was for being especially ferocious in battle. And now we're also controlled that that's not as big a thing. What was the Shattered Shield for again?
I think it was also for like dying repeatedly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If that was a thing, I probably would have got that award from the newbie bear pit I was in.
It was some particular kind of death. I was just looking at this list. I should have it to mind. I can't remember. So what happened was they had a shield and it broke, and so they made it into an award. And the deal was you're supposed to do some damage to it. And somebody at some point was so sick of it they threw it in the fire, and so it became destroyed. And then someone attached that to a new shield, and sort of it is this thing that has died and come back several times throughout the history of the SCA. And then there's the whimsical Order of the Ailing Wit, which is for being incredibly bad at puns.
Oh yeah, Appledore is definitely full of those, but unofficially, of course.
Yeah.
'Cause apparently-
Appledore's version is the jawbone of the ass.
Yeah, but technically half the people I know here should have a woe. Because
Again, I don't think those are being given out very much anymore. They sort of had their time in the 90s, I guess, and then they sort of fell out of favor.
well, if it was still a thing, pretty sure a lot of the officers and other people in the Shire would have that.
You could petition the king, man. You know, it's
I will. That's a great idea.
So AOA is typically the first award that everyone gets. And again, I find it's sort of funny because the stuff that it confers is very technically it's only relevant in a very formal technical way. It doesn't change very much. Grants of arms, obviously there's the three kinds. You guys know the lame jokes in the grants of arms, right? Do you know why the goot is called the goot? You know what a goot is?
Drop of blood.
A goot, so it's for like a service. It's the mid-level service award, right? And so it's a drop of blood. Do you know why the pelican is called the pelican? Pelicans pull feathers out of their own breasts to feather their own nests. And so in the Middle Ages, it's thought that they were pulling their own hearts out and feeding them to their young. And so they became a symbol of selfless love, which is why the pelican people who serve are given that order. And so the drop of blood is like a small token of the pelican. So it's like you're on the way to being a pelican, but you're just a small drop instead of the whole thing. And then a laurel, of course, is the laurel leaves of Roman victory. And in the arms of An Tir, the laurel is being held aloft by a lion in its paw. And so if you're in the mid-level arts award is the jambe de lion, it's the arm of the lion, because the arm is like moving towards the laurel, but it's not actually the laurel. And so there are some terrible, terrible puns. I actually find them delicious, but they're terrible, terrible visual puns in both of those mid-level awards. The Great Goose Chef, sadly, I don't think there is a terrible pun in there because there isn't actually a patent level archery award. So yeah, what are you gonna do? And the fourth level is, of course, the peerage. And I've discovered the symbols of the laurels and the pels. The knights obviously have the white belt, the chain, and the spurs. I was looking for my chain today when I was getting dressed and I couldn't find it. So apparently I'm a really terrible knight. And masters of defense, of course, are for riding or for archery. Sergeants, courtiers, yeomen.
They're not for archery, man.
What's that?
Masters of defense are not for archery.
Did I say archery? I meant rapier. Rapier. I'm sorry, I had the gray goose shaft stuck in my head. It was confusing me. They're for long, pokey things that, you know, heavy fighters resent. The orders of sergeantry, courtiers, yeomen, and gallants and lancers. I find this a super cool order. So in the old days of An Tir, and this was instituted quite early in An Tir, it was AS 12, so An Tir had only been a principality for a couple of years. What ended up happening, do you remember earlier we were talking about that long trek from An Tir down to the sort of the central area of the West, and how it was really a giant production to get to those major kingdom events and so on. The problem is that people from the outlying areas like An Tir would only encounter Western knights once a year, maybe twice a year if they were lucky. And so they'd show up, they would kick ass, and in Knights Council, they would say, well, this guy kicks ass, but does he play chess and dance? Which was sort of this is less of a thing now, but traditionally those were the standard questions that you got asked if you were going to be knightly. Not only could you kill people, but did you exhibit knightly qualities? Those questions get asked in different ways now. And so they got frustrated with being passed over for knighthood because they were unknown. And so LionsGate instituted this office, the Office of Sergeantry. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a childhood emergency. I'll be right back. Talk amongst yourselves for a moment.
And that's what we get for working on Zoom.
I can help a little bit. So His Excellency Sir Antonio was talking about them being offices. They're not technically offices. For those who are unfamiliar with these sort of positions, they're a tested and trialed position where you are in personal service, depending on which flavor of the group that you are, in personal service to the Baron or the Baroness. For the longest time in LionsGate, they were all continually sworn to service to the Baroness. And a part of the logic behind was that all other available hands, all other available fighters, archers, etc., were already sworn to serve the Baron. But the Baroness needed a special, multi-talented and elite tested group that she could call on. Started with the sergeants, as Sir Antonio was saying, with the heavy fighters wanting to be able to prove that they could do things other than fight in an Eric field. They could be chivalric, they could be nobles, peers. From there, the other branches were added, and he's actually missing one, at least in LionsGate. We have another group called the Foresters. So walking from our top down, we've got the sergeants. These are the heavy armored flavor. The second up were, I believe, the yeomen. Yeah, because gallants would have come later. Rapier fighting was later. Yeomen, who are your all over sort of combat or missile skill. So it was target archery and combat archery. It evolved to include some thrown weapons as well. Gallants is the rapier fighter variant. Courtier was something that was come up with as an alternative for the non-martial arts. So in LionsGate, it started with arts and sciences and diplomacy and negotiation. One of the things that was the coolest about the training or the trials that I undertook for Courtier was that I had to negotiate a peace treaty. And every applicant was given a different set of diplomatic or legal problems to sort of solve as part of their testing, because they weren't fighting. But the first couple of years we did yeoman, first couple of years we did courtier, all of the testing was the same. So regardless of what kind you were testing for, you did the same testing for titles. For example, the titles and regalia that we were talking about, one of the reasons why I was familiar with some of the things that you could wear with some of those titles was because it was part of my courtier testing. Geography testing, dance testing, games, heraldry, being able to identify prominent peers in your area. And then with things like the dance testing, because it started with sergeants, you did your first dance test in armor.
So sorry.
And they had us continue to do that regardless of, like, I was a fighter at the time, even though I wasn't testing for sergeant. I did my dance testing in armor because everybody did their dance testing in armor. And it sort of has evolved from that starting point as sergeants who wanted to be known as more than just fighters, which is the segue back for His Excellency.
It sounds like you've covered my entire thing here. So yeah, I find it interesting, this move, sort of the modern role of sergeantry, because it no longer is what it used to be. And it's interesting that you frame it in terms of wanting to be known as something other than a fighter, because to me, and I'm not a sergeant, but it feels to me like it's much more devolved to what actual sergeants were historically, which is it's sort of the non-commissioned officers of the Ontarian combat force. It's people who some of them get knighted, absolutely. Many of them won't though. And it's the people who have sort of shown a lot of dedicated competence in a variety of skills, and that sort of establishes them as sort of the bread and butter kind of fighting community. Does that more or less replicate what you were saying?
No, not really. I talked about the testing and the set of varied skills, because it's a very different thing for me. I tested and I passed my trials a little bit less than being in the SCA for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was a broad skill set to be able to say, okay, I want to play in the SCA. What are all the things I need to know at least a little bit about and be semi-competent in? I think one of the first things I said was I described it as an elite special force for the Baroness.
Yeah, so my totally patronizing knightly perspective is it's less elite and more, it's the people who are the dependable, hardworking core of people in the community, right? So I mean, in many ways, it's perfect that you did it, and like you know, you're now the seneschal, right? So the idea that it sort of puts you in sort of the core of things rather than being a person who just shows up, puts on armor, parties hard all night, and then goes away. I'm not sure if that's a different way to say the same thing or a completely different thing, but there you go. So what I'd like to do now is I just have a giant glossary of terms, and I just want to do the same thing we did with the royalty. Let's just fly through them. I'm pretty sure we're going to know all of them really, really quickly, but there might be one or two stumblers in there that it wouldn't be a terrible idea to sort of learn what they mean. Okay, I hate this term. Does anyone know what Scadian is?
Us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another one of those ones that grates on me. It's like garb. It grates on me.
Me too. Garb. I hate garb. We'll get to garb later. Or smalls. I'm glad to hear that I have an ally in the anti-garb thing. Gentle. Gentle's pretty straightforward as a noun. If I say there is a gentle over there.
A person.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's funny because to me, this is just like I say a person, and that's why I translated in my head. But I think, like for people like the Kendalls, it was more than that. It was that gentility was a thing that was sort of deeply important to them. Populace is pretty much everyone. Squire, I assume we don't need to define squire, apprentice, protege, and provost. Do we know those ones?
I just want to say, it's my protocol grain poking out again.
Sure.
People who address themselves as Squire Fred. Well, no, you're actually Fred, Squire to Sir Joan. Okay, you're not. It's not a title. That's another one of my soapboxes. Sorry.
That's totally fair. I'm ambivalent about that one, and I'm ambivalent about it because you're right. It's not a job description, or it's not a title. It's a job description. But we use job descriptions as titles all the time, right? Baker Joe and Butcher Bob. A provost. Catherine has very helpfully told me that she doesn't know what that means. Does anyone know what a provost is?
That's our rapier. It's like a rapier squire.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it's a student to somebody who's a master of defense. Minister, I'm just going to give you this one because it's kind of a weird one. A minister is we often refer to people as master as part of their title. So master of stables, for instance, and minister is just a gender neutral term that is becoming increasingly popular. Mistress and master are terms that, as somebody who's in the language biz mundanely, I find super interesting. Because of course, as a white guy, I find those terms totally neutral, but I've read a bunch of people who live in other parts of the States and are especially of African descent, that those terms are, for excellent reasons, really grating. And so I find this is a super interesting moment where it's worth thinking about the intersection between the modern and the mundane, because for the most part, I want to separate out and all that stuff I keep talking about where we embody these sort of historical ideals. That's all well and good, right up until we come up against something like this, which is like, that actually is a deeply ingrained personal thing that I feel like we kind of need to respect. And so I myself, I'm really ambivalent. I'm not sure what to do about terms like mistress and master, because I recognize their deeply problematic history in the modern world. But I have literally no idea what substitution we would use for that. Like, what would we call all of the people who are in the orders of the Laurel and the Pelicans?
I've seen people use the terms in other languages, which is kind of a fake out.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing is, we can draw a picture of a sun, but we can't use a swastika because in the modern world, it has some pretty horrible and traumatizing effects.
Absolutely. Well, there's this interesting thing. This will never happen, so I feel totally comfortable putting it out, but I'm not suggesting it as a future path for the SCA. There was some talk in the early days of the Laurels being Knights of the Laurel, and so instead of having Knights and Laurels, all of the peerages would be knighthoods, and there would be different orders of knighthood, just as there are mundanely. So just as there is the Order of the Bath and the Order of the Garter, there would be Knights of Combat and Knights of the Laurel and Knights of the Pelican and Knights of the Rapier, I guess, which I find an intriguing possibility. It won't work. The inertia is way too far in the other direction, but I think that would have been a cool and elegant solution, which would have had a lot of interesting implications for the SCA if that had gone that way. There's like, I find the social stratification of peerages really interesting, where technically all peers are equal, but I think we all recognize that there is different levels of equality of peerages. And it's, I feel pretty comfortable saying this as a knight. I think there's an inverse proportion of status to actual worth. Like the Pelicans, if they stop doing their thing, the SCA will shut down. If the Knights all went away, the SCA would be very different and we'd be sad, but like events would keep happening, and so I find that interesting. Dame. She's a really good dame. Anyone know what that was? Other than something Humphrey Bogart would say. Dame is it's a modern term that women who are knighted use. And so it's a term that some women who are not comfortable using masculine terms use if they're knights. I got to tell you, 100% of the female knights I know prefer sir. And I think this might relate to the military, where women are no longer referred to as ma'am if they're superior officers. So I think that's working out well. Lord Lady, I'm going to skip over. Herald we talked about, so we don't need that one. Marshal.
Your Excellency.
Yes.
Dame is also one of the more popular alternatives for mistress in the other peerages. I know several Pelicans who prefer to refer to themselves as Dame.
Oh yeah. Is there a male version of that? Like, is there because Dame is a nice, it's not just French for mistress?
No, not that I know of. A lot of as Tanique was saying, a lot of the things that come in for master and mistress are often just the cultural language names. Because changing master to meister obviously makes it better.
It fixes everything, exactly. Yes. We've talked about the complex jobs of marshals being both the people who know stuff about arms, but also the people who know about yelling things. It's also, of course,
safety.
What's that?
They're the safety guys or girls.
Yeah, technically. Yes, they are totally the safety people. But it's also, of course, an adjective that we use to describe any activity related to fighting. So we talk about martial skill, martial arts, martial events, things like that. Coronation. What happens at one of those?
Someone gets crowned for something.
I think that somebody help me out with this, because I haven't actually been to many of these. The stepping up of a prince is not referred to as a coronation, is it?
Cornet.
What distinguishes the event where they win from
An
the event where
investiture, you invest anyone
they
who's not
investiture?
coronated.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So prince and princess, baron and baroness, they're invested,
Right.
and the sovereign is crowned.
Mhm.
Hence, investiture.
What he said.
You already have it there.
No, I don't know what you're talking about. Crown term, of course, where they win. 12th night, of course, comes from 12th night, the 12th day after 12th day of Christmas. Yeah. We talked about device. Device is a silly term, I think, in the SCA to a large extent because it technically distinguishes arms that haven't been registered with the College of Heralds. But as there's no actual distinction, it's not like you're not allowed to carry them in exactly the way people carry arms. I find that distinction academic in sort of the negative sense of that word. Authorization. Master of Stables, what's an authorization?
Getting carded.
It's almost the reverse of getting carded, right? It's becoming qualified to get carded.
Oh, right, yeah. Qualified to
think
get carded.
A card,
Thank you.
so that you're safe. You get carded. Okay. Bardic Circle. I feel like these are less of a thing than they used to be. Are there still tons of Bardic Circles and I'm just not invited to them, or are they less
In
popular now than once?
Appledore, we do lots of like Bardic. It's
Oh.
like in the evening at events, it's like we have songbooks.
Oh,
It's
crazy.
not like, sit down, be quiet, listen to the bard. It's more like, oh, let's all sing a song together and chat, and it's really fun.
It's funny. I was thinking, so I've been thinking a bunch about my crotchety old, like what was the SCA like a long time ago, and what are the things that would be worth bringing back, and what should be jettisoned forever. And one of the things I was thinking was, I remember there used to be a lot more sing-alongs. There was all sorts of great like chorus songs that people, like, you didn't even need to know the words, you could figure them out. And I started making a list of them, and they were all like songs that you couldn't sing now because they were either like totally sexist or kind of offensive one way or another. It's like, let's not bring those back because those are terrible.
Yeah, like Tanique would know this one. At Golden Swan in 2019, that was my first event, big Appledore event that I went to. And we had our feast that I helped cook a little bit for. And then we had all the swans and everybody else just start singing this song, and it was so magical. We're in candle and firelight, and it was really cool.
Awesome.
We
It
were
was-
singing some rounds. I remember that.
Yeah, it was the rose round.
Oh, that's a
Yeah.
good one. I like that one.
It was that puts me to sleep some days just thinking about that. It's nice.
I keep meaning to go back to Golden Swan, but it's always on a time when I've got other family obligations.
It's fun.
I don't think I have my dress anymore. I have to make a new one. The blue card is, of course, the authorization card. Court is
Membership
pretty-
card.
What's that?
Blue card is your membership card, is it not?
Dry, damp, wet site is one that's probably worth making sure we all know.
Yeah, I don't know what all those mean. I know dry means no alcohol, right?
And this is your 15-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. If dry is no booze, wet we should probably be able to work out by logic.
Booze allowed, yeah.
And just
And while you're
discreetly
typing
damp.
that out,
What's that?
I said, while you're typing that out, I'm going to point out that officially damp sites do not exist.
A damp site is a misnomer implying that there is a site that has a technical rule against drinking where if you hide everything, then it's okay. But that would be wrong, so we don't do that.
Oh, perfect description.
Barb, Tanique, do you want to take this one?
Basically costumes.
Yeah.
Yes, but it grates on me because there's nothing wrong with the word costume. It's a perfectly period word for clothing. We
Yeah,
can
that-
say medieval clothing, we can say costume. Garb is a sheaf of wheat. It's
Now-
an
when I
extremely
first started doing
modern term
SCA,
for clothing.
yeah, when I started, it was like, what's garb? Isn't it just costume?
Yeah.
Like, no, it's garb. I'm like, okay, don't hurt me.
But it's a horrible, horrible modern word.
Yeah, I don't like it either. It is technically, historically, it was used for clothing, and the word costume actually is very, very late in period to be used for costume. My bugbear is we're all speaking modern English, so I recognize there's no, like, the word kingdom. We need to use a historical word for that because it's a historical thing. But there's words for costume that are perfectly acceptable words. The one thing I will concede to the garb crowd is costume does carry implications of cosplay and dress up, which, and again, I keep saying this, I think in a world where we are trying to actually inhabit those identities, not using the word costume is, I suppose there's some legitimate reason for it. But yeah, the word garb just makes me batty. I hate it. Gate?
Yeah, when I hear costume, I hear break out the elf ears and the fairy wings.
Yeah, and fair enough, But of course, in both modern English and historical English, that was a word that was actually used for the stuff you just wore all the time, right? But I do appreciate that there are associations with it. Gate, we all know, is
How
the place
you
where you
get into
come
another-
in, but it's also, we often refer to it as the money you pay and so on. Gold key,
loaner gear.
I heard at some point gold key was no longer as much a thing. That's not true. Is gold key is still going strong? And
LionsGate's still going strong. Yeah.
heavy and light in the combat context.
Heavy would be smashy with rattan. Light is considered rapier, is it not?
We're kind of moving away from heavy and light because of the implications. We're going with heavy rattan versus steel, which is rapier and cut and thrust.
Right.
Because
don't
there's
think-
some unpleasant connotations or the way
Positive
people
and
are
negative?
perceiving it. Yeah.
That's funny because to me that they're accurate terms which have no connotations at all. I like not having to put on heavy armor and do rapier sometimes.
Yeah.
I never actually heard light referred to as rapier, and I mean that could in fact be the way it's commonly used now. To me, it's always referred to like archery and auxiliary forces on the warfield, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Hold. We all know in fighting, hold means stop, but
Yep.
it also is commonly used just for everything, right? It's the common stop what you're doing thing.
Safety word, basically.
Yeah. This is the yes, it's the SCA safe word, exactly. Does anyone know why the Eric is called the Eric?
No, I don't.
So the Eric in the West Kingdom in the early days, they had they had two ropes around the list field. The first one had red flags, and it was called Eric the Red, and the second one was yellow, and I forget what it was called. But because Eric the Red became a common term, they would refer to the Eric as the rope that surrounded the list field. And just by extension, and there are lots of purists who say this is deeply wrong because it never meant that, it's come to mean the field itself, but it was all from the red flags on the thing. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these because I'm running out of time. Mundane, we're not supposed to use that word anymore. I don't know if is that still a word in use?
As far as I know, it is.
We're
Yeah.
trying to move it away from mundane and use modern, again, for the connotations.
I do remember using the word mundane to someone in my family, like in the 80s when I was first starting out, and they were quite offended by it. So that is a thing. Period just means historically accurate. Persona is your
Basically,
identity.
a character.
Yeah. Removes.
Janique and I had a conversation about that at Golden Swan, did we not?
Yeah, remove is an Elizabethan term for a course because you actually removed to a different room for the course. In a banquet, yeah.
So now it should be called to get the heck out of here. Cool. And site turning in waiver, we can probably just figure out by context. Okay, so that's all the terminology. Are there any other terms that you feel like we ought to have on this list that are confusing, things that get thrown around a lot that are annoying?
Well, yeah, there's like the ones where you see people when they sign their names, it's like HL or THL. It's like, what the heck does that mean? I don't understand those.
So it's called alphabet soup. You see this in academics all the time. They have all the title names. So it's like Dr. Smith, MD, to indicate that they're a medical doctor as opposed to something else. So this is Honorable Lord or their Honorable Lordship. So those are titles for having a grant level awards. I often on Ask the Knights or Ask the Chivalry sign my name KSCA. So it's if you work it out, it's always referring to the title that they have from some award. So you can probably solve it just by recognizing that as context.
Well, thank you.
No problem. Yeah. So alphabet soup is the common referring term for that. Anything else? Anyone else have any terms that they've encountered that have bothered them that they've been too chicken to ask anybody?
Smalls.
Smalls.
Someone
Oh
mentioned.
my God. I was just looking at, I think this was actually in the current newcomer handbook. They said that you can call children halflings or smalls.
Oh God.
Halflings is awful for all kinds of reasons, but smalls, in period, smalls were your underwear. They were your
Underwear.
small clothing.
Small clothes.
So yeah.
So somebody's trying to get the reference to "you're killing me" smalls to children.
Oh,
Okay.
it's that has been around for like 40 years, Leslie. When I
Yeah.
started, that was a thing. Luckily, it's
Wow.
never really caught on. Yeah.
Children is a perfectly medieval word. I don't know why we need to cute it up.
Oh, dragon
Yeah.
is another one that makes me crazy. I think this one might be going out of fashion. People often talk about their cars, their dragon, which makes me crazy because, like, if you think about the sentence, "I'm going to go get my sleeping bag from the dragon," how did it get there? How are you going to get it back? Are you going to want it? Get it? Are you going to want it when you get it back? And we have all these historical words for car, like car, for instance, which is a word that shows up in Shakespeare a whole pile of times. But even wagon or carriage is perfectly acceptable, right?
Yeah, what is it? My friend calls her car Yon Beastie.
I'll take it. That's better than dragon.
Yeah, I haven't heard dragon used as a term before, but I just may have not been paying attention.
Yeah.
Nergui says Hosenscheiser is technically the word for toddlers in German.
Do you want to translate that for us, buddy?
I think you can break it down.
Probably. It's like hose head, right? Okay. So there are two excellent resources if you're not familiar with these that you should check out. The first one is if you go to the SCA website and click on "I'm a newcomer," there is a newcomer's handbook that I find it's a really good précis of sort of all the information. Bjorn, if you haven't looked at this, you might want to check it out because if nothing else, it's like 17 pages. And I'm not sure how they would feel about people printing it out, but if I was doing any shadowing work, I would print out 30 copies of this and just have it to hand to people, because it's a really nice sort of welcome to the SCA document.
Thanks. That's under new to the SCA. I think I'm on the website right now.
Yeah.
Which one was that again? Sorry.
So if you go to sca.org and click on "I'm new to the SCA," there's a thing called the Newcomer's Handbook, or I think Halbjorn can tell me exactly what it's called.
I just
New
paid money
members
for that.
guide.
Yeah, Newcomer's Guide. I can pop this in the chat for you, I think.
I just paid money for that with my membership.
You can get a hard copy, but they also have it for free. They've got a soft version that you can download as a PDF.
Okay.
The other
Yes,
thing
yes.
is, if you don't know this, the West Kingdom has this absolute goldmine of historical information of the SCA called the West History Project. that sort of is, especially for the first like decade of the SCA, it's a breakdown of all of the early events, and it comes with commentary. So a bunch of the old people who were there in the first couple of years sort of have gone onto the site, and there's a back and forth commentary where they start talking to each other about, I don't remember this happening. Didn't you have this other thing? No, I could have sworn it was this other person. And so it's just an absolute feast of super interesting historical information, which is presented very nicely and just a hoot to read. Okay, well, I got that much closer to 2 hours than I thought I would. So that's everything I've got. Are there any questions from anyone else before we wrap this up at the 2-hour mark? Cool. I have one question, and you don't need to tell me, and I think it's actually in the form. Because I've never taught this course before, if I was teaching it again, is there anything you think I should do differently? You can tell me now, you can email me later, however you
Or
wish
you can,
to put that forward.
there, I'll put that
Put it in the feedback forms.
feedback forms. Yeah,
Yeah. Awesome.
it's in the chat. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well,
Well,
thanks for
thank
coming.
you, Sir Antonio,
Very
for
informative.
doing
Thank you.
this.
Excellent. I'm glad you guys all came. It was really enjoyable. Thanks for encouraging me to meander off in crazy other random directions. It was fun. And I will see you all around.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
You too.
Thank
See ya.
you.